Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another player ranking for a Survivor season I've done a retrospective of, this time doing it for Survivor Palau, where here we obviously have 20 players to rank, and ranking them based on how I feel like they played on this season, not them as players in the grand scheme of things. And I would say Palau's probably one of the strangest player rankings here, in the sense that obviously we have the complete desolation of Oolong, and through that there's a lot of people that make it very deep into the game that probably shouldn't have made it very deep into the game. And now the fact that we also got that initial purge at the very beginning, again, does lead to some wonkiness here. But again, let's just start all off at number 20. The worst player from Survivor Palau for me is Jonathan Libby. And this was a bit of a debate for me in the sense that should I even include Jonathan and Wanda, as obviously they were taken out of the game due to wonky circumstances, were taken out due to a schoolyard pick, not a formal round of gameplay. However, I decided to still include them simply because they still had an opportunity in the game, and we at least know what happened to them. I mean, unlike someone like Jenna Maraska and All Stars, where we never really got a sense on the show of where exactly she landed in the game, and Jonathan Libby's someone that we got a good sense of where Jonathan Libby is in the game, especially from post-game stuff, in the sense that no one liked him, and that's obviously the reason why he wasn't picked here. That, again, if they had gone to a tribal, he more than likely would have been the boot. Supposedly, he was very standoffish, he didn't bother talking to many people, also he jumped off the vote at the very beginning, which turned some people off, to where, while obviously Stephanie was able to stay away from that stigma, Jonathan is someone that just, again, did not really gel with people, to where he could not get away with that. And the fact that, again, he wasn't picked for a tribe in a spot where he was one of the most physical guys on this season is pretty insane. I think that is a massive indictment on him as a player. Now, I will say again, I do think he gets a bit unlucky in the fact that Karen was the one picking, where I think had it been a different person picking last, they probably do just pick him for the sake of physical strength. But I still think at the end of the day, Jonathan Libby just seemed to kind of suck. And considering just how big of a physical threat he was, the fact that he was taken out at the very beginning is a massive indictment on him, to where, again, I have him at 20. Now, 19, another person that was taken out at the very beginning. We're just finishing off the people taken out at the very beginning. We got Wanda. And again, Wanda's one that is a bit tough to rank just because, again, there's not really much to say there. I mean, she's just someone that, again, is on the older side of things. Obviously, she is very disadvantaged in terms of being picked for a tribe because of that. Beyond that, she's also annoying. No one liked her. She sang songs constantly. People rolled their eyes constantly. Again, like, there's not really much to say. I think she's someone that, again, people didn't like, was a physical liability, and just kind of an easy person to take out. To where, again, I think had she made it on a tribe, she probably ends up being the first vote out anyway. I don't think it really changes that much. And that's a lot of the reason why both Jonathan and Wanda are at the bottom of this list, and even I decided to put them on this list anyways, because I feel pretty confident that he just would have been the first boots anyway. If not, at least early boots, to where, again, I don't think either of them were particularly poised to make it deep into the game, and I feel like Wanda is someone here that didn't really seem that much skill for the game, because at least is someone that, again, was naturally disadvantaged, unlike Jonathan, who has no real excuse for being the first boot of the season. To where, again, because of that, for me, I do have Wanda here, number 19. Now, number 18, we're moving on to a person that made it deeper into the game. Also someone that probably shouldn't have made it as far as he did, and that person is Willard. And, I mean, you can technically look at Willard as the bottom place person on this list. Again, he is the bottom place person to be formally eliminated from the game. And, again, I think Willard's someone that, again, just probably shouldn't even made it as far as he did. Again, I think he was pretty much always going to be the first boot for whenever he went to tribal. Obviously, Kror doesn't lose a challenge. Very little of that due to the things that Willard actually does, and because that he makes it deeper into the game, but is, again, still the first vote out of Kror in a unanimous vote. In a spot where, again, he had allies. That is something to at least praise him for. Again, he was really close to Kobe. He had connections to, like, Karen and Janud, where, again, some people liked him. Mind you, other people found him annoying. Again, the majority alliance was very anti-Willard, and he's also someone that, again, probably would have been just taken out at the very beginning had not been for Karen making that decision, which, again, credit to him for building bond with Karen. Karen also having some foresight into thinking that if she keeps Willard around, that he'll probably be booted before her. But really, at the end of the day, it's not that much to praise, considering that won't matter in most situations. Where, again, I think Willard is in a spot here where I think he plays pretty abysmally. Sort of one saving grace, the fact that, again, he, like, just naturally would have been looked at as a physical liability. So I think that's less damning. But again, mixing that in the fact that he also, like, turned away, like, half his tribe, I think is also a big negative there, to where, again, I don't think he played particularly well, which is why he's here, number 18. Now, number 17, moving on to another person that was the first booted from their tribe, we got Jolanda. And Jolanda, for me, was a bit of a debate with Willard. Obviously, again, similar cases of being the first vote out of their respective tribes. Both had allies. Again, Jolanda had the likes of Ibrahim and Bobby John on her side. And I think it is actually a bigger indictment that Jolanda goes home here in a spot where, again, she was the leader of her tribe. She was definitely the most physical woman of her tribe, and really had no real excuse for being the first boot, which is why I do think, in comparison to Willard, obviously, you would think that would make Willard better. However, for me, I do think it's a spot where Willard is someone that, again, potentially goes out right away, had it not been for Thinking very fortunate in the fact that it was Karen in particular that got to save him. Well, I feel like Jolanda, even though obviously she had immunity through that round, I do think she's very unlikely to not get picked by the end of that schoolyard pick, to where I think that, like, that's something that's pro Jolanda, along the fact that I feel like Jolanda, had she survived, probably has a bit more wiggle room than Willard, who I think is kind of screwed no matter what, to where, again, I think those are like minor differences enough for me to put her here at number 17. Now, number 16, moving on to the next boot of the season, we got Ashley Ashby. And Ashley's someone that I don't think is entirely bad, and that really goes on with the rest of this list. I feel like everyone from this point forward has like some positives to their games. And I think Ashley's actually someone that we could debate has more positives than the next person we'll be talking about. But Ashley's someone that, again, like, had allies, and she had seemingly a very good alliance with Stephanie and Angie. They seemingly had James on their side, and Ashley had enough votes to at least tie the vote. Coming into tribal, or considering Oolong's Perpetuity to tie the vote moving forward, I think had she wanted to, I think they probably do go to a tie, and who knows what happens following that. Where I would assume the likes of Bobby John and Ibrahim would have been a lot more likely to flip. And even then, I mean, that's considering Ibrahim on the other side had a very close relationship with Ashley, to where, again, we even see in the tribal where she goes home that he's unwilling to vote for her, to where, again, she probably wins the day in that vote had she wanted to. But that is part of the issue. The fact that supposedly Ashley essentially just quit, that she didn't want to be there. She was willing to get voted out. And that led to people not really fighting for her to stay by the end. Yeah, I do think it's a spot where had she had this gusto to play the game, I think she actually was in a somewhat decent spot to make it at least further into the season. But the thing is that obviously she didn't have the gusto, and she is someone that was still booted in that spot. Where I do think Ashley someone's a bit tough to rank. Again, in comparison to the next person we'll be talking about, that person, again, does end up surviving over Ashley, and even survives another tribal following that, to where, again, I think, and the fact that Ashley just simply was the second boot of the season, also, again, did not really have this itch to play the game, I think is enough to put her below the next person we'll be talking about, even though I think Ashley's someone that probably had a little bit more potential. But again, Ashley ends up being here number 16. Now, number 15, moving on to someone that, again, you could debate is lower. Again, I think this person's pretty bad, but they survive a decent while, and again, actually survive some tribals along the way. That person is Kim. And again, I don't think Kim is a particularly good player. I think Kim is someone that just seemed to be kind of useless out there. Also, again, didn't seem to enjoy the experience. Talked about quitting. Again, Kim kind of sucks, but again, she survives 3 tribals, which, I mean, considering the type of player Kim is, I think that's a little bit surprising. And she survives over Jolanda, where she's actually involved in flipping the vote into Jolanda, so I mean, that's something. Ashley vote, again, she was going to be booted. Again, kind of gets lucked out by the fact that Ashley wants to quit, along with the fact that also she had someone like Jeff really fighting for her to stay, where I do think had not been for Jeff, I think she probably just goes there. Which, again, I do think her relationship with Jeff is also major aspect of her game, and even at her actual boot tribal. Again, she is somewhat close to having the votes to stay. It did seem like there was going to be a tie vote. Again, it did seem like the women did talk about creating an all-girls group and did seriously consider saving her, yet obviously, again, by the end, they don't. So, where, again, Kim's just kind of all over the place. Again, I do think Ashley is someone that I actually think probably has more potential in the game than someone like Kim, where I think Kim is someone that probably should have just been in an earlier boot. But again, she definitely goes home with the Jeff vote had he not been injured, and again, probably goes to the Ashley vote had she had not had all these other situations happen. Yet again, she still does survive those votes. She survives over Ashley and almost stays in her boot round, to where, again, it's not a particularly good game, but I do think those minor positives are enough to put her here at 15. Now, number 14, we're actually jumping forward quite a bit, going to the next Koror member on the board, meaning that we're going pretty deep into the game, as obviously every Koror member outside of Willard made the jury. And with that, we're going to be starting this off with Janu. And again, Janu is also this very weird case where I do think if Koror had gone to more tribals, I do think Janu is probably just gone pre-merge. So obviously, she seemed to want to quit. She didn't really enjoy the experience out there for the majority of it. She didn't really gel with the majority of the cast. It seemed like she only really had a connection with Kobe by the time she leaves. So again, Janu just seems to be a pretty bad player. Again, I don't think anyone really liked her, really respected her. Yeah, she was even the backup during the actual Kobe vote. And she was poised to make a deep run. And obviously, that's a bit of a weird thing with Janu as well, is the fact that obviously she just later quit the game in a spot where, again, she was at least getting to 7. Now, again, does she get booted at 7? Probably. But really, outside that, again, Janu's just on the bottom pretty much the entire time. Again, I think very fortunate there is a Willard on her tribe to keep the target off of her initially. And though once Willard is gone, again, she's just kind of the easy next target. And again, had she not been on Koror, which has won so many challenges, she probably doesn't even make it to the spot where she could potentially quit the game. Where, well, again, she doesn't go out due to natural circumstances. I do feel like her game surrounding that is pretty bad, which is why she's here at number 14. Now, number 13, moving on to a step better than Janu, I guess, even though this person went out before her. But at number 13, I do have Kobe. And Kobe's a player that I really want to put higher, just simply because I do think Kobe demonstrated a lot of skill for the game. I mean, we see him at the very beginning be the one to do a lot of the active work into putting the vote onto Jonathan. That ends up tainting his reputation, which leads to him going home. Also, we see Kobe do some decent maneuvering mid-game, and the fact that, yeah, he does let Willard go in a spot where he is close to Willard, but beyond that, again, we do see him build this bond with Greg and Jen, where Greg and Jen talk about actually flipping on their alliance to go with Kobe. And again, it did seem like he was a player that had some legroom at that point. The problem is, I think by the end of his run, I think he just gets kind of bored and kind of frustrated the people around him, to where he kind of just self-sabotages his game. Where obviously he's taken out over Stephanie at the merge vote, but it's still a spot where I do think Kobe had some leg room in the game. To where, in comparison to Janu, I do think he was safer in the game for most of it. Again, I don't think he would have been taken out pre-merge over Janu. And was more so taken out of the merge because he was more threatening than Janu. And beyond, again, I think he had a lot more agency in the game. We see him do a lot more maneuvering through the game. And while, again, some of it was bad, particularly towards the end of the game, I think he at least does more work in the game than someone like Janu. And I think had more potential to win the game. Where I think if Kobe got to the end, I think he would have had some potential to win the game, unlike Janu, who I do think probably loses against almost everybody. So again, I think at the end of the day, I don't look at Kobe too highly as a player. Yeah, I do think there is at least that potential there, which puts him here at number 13. Now number 12. And at number 12, we're finally moving back to Oolong and going from the first juror to the third formal boot of the season. We have Jeff Wilson. And again, Jeff is in this weird spot here where obviously Jeff ends up getting injured, proceeds to tell people to vote him out of the game, and essentially quits the game, where while obviously he struggled walking, I do think he obviously could have survived out there with that injury, and it just seems like he just kind of gives up. So again, that is a qualm. Yeah, I do think Jeff is actually somebody that, had that not been the case, had he not gotten injured, he's probably in a good spot to do pretty well on the season. Again, he seemed to be pretty well insulated in the game. Obviously, he was looked at as one of Oolong's strongest members. And straight up, I do think when they lose Jeff, I think that's really the point where Oolong goes completely downhill, where I think they at least had a fighting chance before Jeff got injured there. But also, again, we do see Jeff do some good work. Again, he really fights to keep Kim around, where Ashley ends up leaving over her, and it seemed to be in a spot where I don't think he's booted anytime soon if he doesn't quit. I think he's probably making it at least to like the final 3 of Oolong, where even if the Oolonging did continue, I feel like he's still taken pretty deep, especially due to his physicality, to where, again, I think he's in a spot where had he not quit, which again stemmed from him being injured, I think he was in a pretty decent position to make it much deeper into the game. Now, obviously at the end of the day, Oolong was kind of screwed no matter what, with them being so down in numbers and Kror seemingly sticking together. But I do think Jeff is someone that probably had some potential here that we obviously just never get to see. But again, for me, I do feel like it's enough to put him here at number 12. Now number 11, moving on to a player that made it further in the game, but also one that gets very lucked out by a certain twist. But I do think there's actually good aspects of his game outside that, and that person is Ibrahim. And Ibrahim's a player that is this low on the list, again, lower than some of the people that made it further than him, simply because he was saved by a twist. Again, it did seem like he was dead to rights at the Angie boot tribal until he was given immunity at the last second, to where, and it seemed like James, Stephanie, and Angie all would have been very solidified in voting for Ibrahim in that spot, to where, again, I think he was a goner. But again, he survives there due to him being handed out immunity, but then also does proceed to survive the following round, where I do think something very good about Ibrahim is that he really maintains his relationship with Bobby John really well. They have a really strong relationship. Despite Ibrahim messing up challenges and being looked at as a physical weakness, Bobby John does fight to keep him for the majority of that season. So it is really until they're down to the final 3 of Oolong that Bobby John ends up finally turning on him. But again, I do think he at least had, again, a very solid ally. He also, again, survives a lot of other tribals. Again, despite the fact that, again, he does obviously get saved by what happened at the Angie vote, he survives so many other tribals outside that. Again, he survives the Delon vote, even though, again, he was on the outs. He survives over Ashley, even though also there he wanted Ashley to stay. But again, he survives over Jeff, even though that was a bit more wonky. But again, he survives over Kim. It survives over James. Again, I think there is some good work there. So I do think he was saved by twists, and again, that is something that does knock him below the next few people will be talking about. I do feel like there's at least some positives there, which put him here at number 11. Now, number 10, just slightly better, even though this person was actually booted before Ibrahim, but that person is James. And James is an interesting player on this season in the sense that I do feel like James's positioning in the game seemed very strange, where, to be fair, Oolong in general didn't really have this like solidified power structure. Yeah, I feel like James is one of these players where like he just seemed to be kind of all over the place, where, and he had this like connection with Bobby John through them having similar backgrounds, but he also seemed to be working with Stephanie and Angie, where he was almost always voting with them. And we do see Stephanie and Angie kind of banking on his vote at points, where, and it kind of seemed like in a way that James was kind of in the middle, even though I don't know how intentional that necessarily was. But again, like Ibrahim, he survives a lot of tribals, but unlike Ibrahim, he's actually in the majority for a lot more of them. Even though, again, he didn't necessarily want Ashley to go in that specific spot, he is still someone that votes with the majority. He obviously is involved in the Belanda boot. He, again, still wanted to vote out Kim during the Jeff tribal and fails at that, but eventually gets her out the following tribal. And I'll say, I think he gets a bit unfortunate at what happens at the Angie boot tribal, where Angie going was probably a net negative for him, as, again, he seemed to have a good relationship with Angie and Stephanie. Now, at the end of the day, I don't know if they really keep him anyway at the final four vote, especially against Bobby John, who's this workhorse. Yeah, at the same time, again, Angie and Stephanie did vote Bobby John over James at the Angie boot round, where, again, maybe there's a chance, but I do think the fact that James was, again, kind of sucking at challenges at that point probably leads to him being voted out next anyway. But still, again, he survives a bit. Again, even in that boot round, he gets a tie with Stephanie, to where, again, had Bobby John not made a deal with Stephanie, I think Stephanie probably fights for him to stay a bit harder, to where, again, James is just kind of someone that's a bit all over the place. I don't really know where he necessarily stood in the game for a lot of it. And he does survive a lot of tribals, was at least in the majority for a lot of them, and that's enough to put him here at number 10. Now, at number 9, instead of wrapping up Oolong, as you would expect, we're actually going back to Kror, a person that made it very deep into the game, but they kind of suck. And that person is Karen. And again, Karen is someone that I actually do think there are some positives to Karen's game on the rewatch. I think Karen is someone that, while she was on the bottom really the entire time, and I do think she relies on Tom a bit too much towards the end game, where I think she had a lot of potential to really make some big moves and just really doesn't do them. I still think it's a spot where Karen, I think, did some good work to survive at certain points in the game. Like, obviously we know about the initial tribe pick, where, again, she picks Willard in a spot where she knew Willard would be voted out before her, and through that one, kind of a shield for her, while also she had a good relationship with Willard. Again, I think that was overall very good move there. And again, that keeps her safe leading into the merge. And to be fair, even into the merge, she probably still doesn't go home. I think Janu probably goes home before her. Mind you, a lot of that's because Janu wanted to quit. But still, I think the fact that Karen, again, probably was better positioned in the game than Janu and Willard is, again, at least something there. Now, again, by the time the merge, she's kind of just on the bottom and voting alongside the majority, where Kobe goes and Stephanie goes. But again, I do think she has some scrappiness during the final 6 round that keeps Ian and Tom on board to flip the vote on Greg. I think that's pretty good work. I think the issue is obviously the fact that she gets booted immediately afterwards to the final 5. It's probably, especially for like Tom, where Tom lets Karen go. Again, that's again kind of dumb for him. But even then, I do think she at least had the wherewithal to flip on at least Ian. At least I don't know if she necessarily would have done the same to Tom, but again, she at least does try to flip the vote on the men. She does try to work with the women at that point. And while again she fails because she sucks, I do think it's at least again something. She at least does attempt to make this big move. It's about where I don't know if you necessarily see certain other players, especially on this season, try to make the move that Karen did. Where again, I think that's at least something. Where while I think Karen's game and sucks, I don't think she can win at the end. I think she kind of just is a tag along for a lot of the game, doesn't really do that much actively until the tail end of her game. I feel like at least that is something, and there's again at least sprinkles of stuff early on as well to again, have her here at number 9. And now number 8, and we're moving back to Oolong for someone that was kind of screwed. So realistically considering Oolong's trajectory, I don't know how deep they would have made anyway, but again, definitely screwed out in their position that they were taken out at, and that person is Angie. And Angie, again, gets very much screwed over in her actual boot round, where just out of nowhere, Kror is able to give immunity to someone from the other side, which saves Ibrahim, and obviously, again, leads to Angie be taken out, and even then, in a 2-2-1 vote, where she gets taken on the revote, which is all very strange as well, where, and Angie's someone that I do think gets very unfortunate in how she ends up going out, and I think she has a pretty solid recovery in the game, where she starts off like seemingly on the bottom, barely gets saved with her getting picked at the very last second, but beyond that, like seemingly plays like decently well. She plays alongside Stephanie, and they're kind of this duo maneuvering through the game, where again we see them lead the charge against Yolanda. We see them again almost keep Ashley in the game, though that falls through. We also see them again really push the vote to take out Jeff, even though again that was probably more benefited by Jeff himself wanting to quit. And again, we see them almost keep around Kim. And I do think it's a spot where I think had they not been on a season that was so focused around challenges and been in a spot where again Oolong was just losing challenge after challenge after challenge, where they need to keep around the strong people, I think there's a shot to fight hard to keep Kim, and in that spot they're able to really take the reins of the game. Yeah, Angie, I think it's a bit unfortunate being on a season that was so challenge focused, even though to be fair, she clearly became one of the stronger women of the tribe, which kept her safe over the likes of Ashley and Kim as well. But still, I think Angie's actually someone that I think is actually a competent player. Again, I think coming into my rewatch, I never looked at Angie particularly highly. I think having rewatched it, again, seeing her, like, again, kind of maneuver through the game as this duo with Stephanie, and again, kind of getting screwed at the end, I think, again, I end up thinking of Angie as, again, a pretty solid pre-jury player. Again, for me, that's enough to put her here at number 8. Now, number 7, keeping with Oolong, where we only have 2 people from Oolong left on the board, but here we're moving on to Bobby John. And I'll say, I actually think it is kind of close between the final Oolong members, as I do think Bobby John is someone that was more in the power position throughout a lot more of his run on Oolong, where obviously a lot of that does come from physical strength and the fact that he's such a hard worker and people want to keep him around, where again, I think realistically, Bobby John is probably the safest person on Oolong pretty much the entire time, where I think it's very difficult to get Bobby John out of the game early on. Mind you, I think a lot of that is benefited from the fact that he was on a tribe with a lot of similar-minded people. Again, he had this very close bond with Ibrahim from the very beginning. He also had a very similar background to James, where I think James also would have been unwilling to take out Bobby John, where I think those two things very much benefited him, along with the fact that he was obviously one of the most physical people on the tribe. But still, Bobby John was in a very good spot. Again, he pretty much survives the entire Oolonging while also being the decision-maker at the last couple votes of that Oolonging, to where again, I think that it's pretty impressive. Now, I think when you look at his game practically, obviously there's some more nitpicks. Obviously, again, he was not the most strategically minded person in the world. He was not doing a lot of this actively, and I do think outside of cultivating his relationship with Ibrahim, I don't think there's really that much you can particularly praise him for in the social strategy department of the game, outside of, again, just not being a beatable presence that makes people want to vote you out. But still, I do think Bobby John is someone that probably had a lot of potential here, and I think there's an argument between, again, him and Stephanie, where again, I think he was better positioned in the game than Stephanie. I think he got his way, particularly in the back portion of Oolong's run, more than Stephanie. I think the difference for me, though, is again, I do think Steph was a lot more active strategically. I think she is someone that, and obviously makes it further, but beyond that, I think it was more in a spot where she was a bit unlucky in how certain things played out, where I feel like Bobby John was actually kind of fortunate in how the tribe dynamic was set out, to where, again, at the end of the day, I think Bobby John played a pretty solid game still, but again, I end up having him number 7. Now, number 6, what a shocker! The person I just mentioned is so close to Bobby John. We got Stephanie! And again, Stephanie's a player that I just think is very tough to gauge. And I think there's actually an argument for her to be higher. Where Stephanie's a player that I think she gets very much unlucky in the game in multiple facets. I think, obviously, just within Oolong, I think she gets unlucky in the fact that it ends up being a tribe that goes to tribal over and over and over again, in a spot where, because of that, physical strength is prioritized. And while obviously she benefits from that in the sense that she's the strongest woman on the board, I think she also gets disfavored in that, and the fact that her allies end up being taken out in a spot where she doesn't really have much leverage to keep them around, because, again, most people obviously want to keep the tribe strong to try to win challenges, even though they never do. But beyond that, again, I think it's impressive that she even makes it to 2. I think the fact that she gets Bobby John to turn against Ibrahim in favor of going to the end with her, which again is based around physical strength, but I think the fact that like Bobby John, who is very honor bound, is willing to do that, I think it was good on Stephanie. I think there's some nitpicks to be had for Stephanie for sure. Again, Ozzy leading the charge against Yolanda, while she is, again, the person to do that, I think it's also kind of a flawed move in getting rid of the strongest people at the very beginning. Also, again, there's a lot of points where she has the leverage to try to get like Ashley and Kim to stay, though doesn't fully go through with that, which again, I think comes down to physical strength, but still is a spot where she technically fails at getting her way. And also, I think her voting for James, and also I think her like siding with James initially was also just kind of questionable. Like, why cause a tie there, especially when all you're doing is just upsetting Ibrahim? Again, that felt questionable, but still, it's like, obviously once she gets the Karor, again, there's not really much she could really do at that point. She's kind of just screwed. She's on the bottom. The fact that she even survives over Kobe is kind of good on her, but again, there's not really much to praise or not much to really dock there, as again, there really wasn't much that she could truly do. But I think a thing to praise Stephanie for, again, especially against Bobby John, the fact that I feel like Stephanie gets very unfortunate in the fact that she was picked for Oolong, where I think if Stephanie was picked for Karor, I think Stephanie's probably part of the dominant alliance that runs the entire season. I think she's in a spot where, again, initially she was in this solid group with Tom, Ian, and Katie, and that's even talked about potentially coming back together post-merge, which obviously never does, but again, like literally her 3 other allies get to the final 3 together, to where, while I'm sure there would have been some rockiness along the way, I do think she's in a spot where, had she been on Karor, I think she probably has an extremely deep run in her, potentially wins the game. And again, probably not because of Tom's comp wins and all that, but still, it's still a spot where I do think Stephanie ends up being very unfortunate in the fact that she was picked for Oolong, where, again, I think she probably does play a pretty dominant game had she been on the other side of things. But again, as it stands, I think the remaining 5 people we have to talk about are, again, people that were part of the core alliance on Karor, and obviously that's a major reason why they're higher on the list. They're part of the major alliance that really ran ran the show the entire season. And while obviously they didn't face as much adversity in the pre-merge phase as Stephanie did, I feel like Stephanie, again, had a bit of a rocky game throughout a lot of it. While I think she gets very unfortunate in a lot of aspects of the game, it's still not a particularly stable game, which is, again, enough to make it tough to put Stephanie much higher on the list for me, which is why she's here at number 6. Now, number 5. At number 5, we're moving on to someone that I think is probably one of the more understated players in Survivor history. I think this is a player that doesn't really get talked about, but I think they played a pretty solid game on the season, with, again, some nitpicks obviously cost them the game, but again, I think a pretty solid game, and that person is Greg. And Greg is someone that I actually expected to be higher on this list, as I think Greg is someone that was a very cerebral player. I think he is someone that comes from the, like, Burton mold, but I think actually probably a better player than Burton. I think he seemed to have a much more stable strategic mind. He seemed to be someone that was, again, willing to go to the outsiders and pick them up as numbers, where we do see him, again, build this relationship with Kobe and try to get Kobe and Janu to flip at Tom when they get down to 7. And again, I think there is some good work there from Greg early on in the game, while also, again, getting him attached to the Majority Alliance. And then we do see him have a lot of influence even post-merge, where, again, he seems to be a major reason why Stephanie goes home in the spot that she does, really fights for that vote in a spot where Tom doesn't want that to go through, where, again, I think he does a lot of good work throughout the season. I think he's in a spot where, had he gotten to the end, I think he's a very likely winner. I think had he executed his initial plan of going to 7 with his alliance plus Janu and Kobe, I think he probably is the most likely winner at that point in the game. The problem is that obviously he doesn't go through with that plan. I think that's the main issue with Greg, is that Greg is a player that talks a lot of good game, but then doesn't end up executing it by the end. And it's this weird spot where it feels like he had this, like, very solid plan that he was set up to do, and then just simply doesn't do it for some reason. Where, again, instead he ends up voting out Kobe at the merge, again, really lessening his options in the game at that point. Once Janu quits as well, again, he's even further screwed, where while, again, he still gets his way in getting Stephanie out, at that point, he's in pretty much his worst case scenario, having, yeah, Tom and Ian still in the game, alongside Karen, who is someone that he doesn't really have attached to him. They're obviously, they end up flipping, and again, get Katie back on board with her not wanting to go to a tie. Again, I think that is an issue. Now, again, I think the bad aspect of going to 6 with Karen is the fact that, again, that just allowed it to be flipped on him, where, again, ideally he would have someone like a Janu, which, to be fair, he was screwed out of as the 6th person. Again, I think that is something to at least note here. But, and had he gone down to 5, he's actually still in a pretty decent spot, where it does seem like Tom would have been the first go. Again, theoretically, obviously Tom wins all the challenges, and again, and all this ends up not really mattering. But again, if Tom had not won out, it does seem like Tom would have gone home at 5. At 4, it probably would have been a 2v2, where if he wins out in that 2v2, if Ian goes home at 4, he's probably in the best position to win the game at that point, where even then, again, he still had inroads to win. Again, I think Greg plays a very solid game. I think he is a very competent player here, and one that I thought about putting higher, but again, at the end of the day, obviously all the other people that we'll be talking about, the remaining 4 players on this list, are literally the top 4. And while I think there's a debate between him and the next person we'll be talking about, I think that person had some strong play towards the end that knocks Greg back down. So again, because of that, Greg is here number 5. Now, number 4, moving on to the person who came in 4th, we have Jen. And again, Jen is someone that initially I was thinking I was going to have Greg over Jen, particularly due to the fact that I think Greg probably beats Jen at the end, and I think she was fully willing to go to the end with him. But the reason I do have Jen higher than him at this point is because, again, Jen survives 2 more tribals than him, where, again, up to that point, I think their games are very similar. While I do think Greg is shown doing a lot more of the active work with someone like Kobe, again, I think their games are pretty similar. They're working together, somehow still not targeted until very deep into the game. I think that is impressive. But again, I think really the strong suit of Jen's game is after Greg leaves. Again, after Greg leaves, she's somehow still not being targeted at 5. Again, that's kind of insane. So again, you would think it would just be so easy to get rid of Jen, yet there doesn't seem to be any talk about getting rid of Jen. Instead, it turns into the women versus men, and that dynamic seems to take more precedence, which is very strange. And I think, again, I would credit that to Jen's reaction to the Greg vote. The fact that she didn't blow up in the way that we see a lot of people do after they're blindsided, to where, again, I think Jen handles that particularly well. And then even at the Final 4, where, and to fair, she did seem like a goner for a bit. Didn't really do much campaigning initially, but once Tom does get paranoid, Ian, we do see Jen again do some pretty good work in spilling all the beans to Tom and getting Tom to at least give her a fighting chance at going to fire, to where, to be fair, again, I don't think she really had a winning path either way, to where I think she would have had to win Final Immunity, which again, I don't think there's any way Tom wasn't winning Final Immunity. But again, I do think Jen is a player that I do think, again, has a pretty competent game. Again, a game that I think is, again, maybe like a step below Greg, but to the point that Greg goes home, but then, again, makes it further than him and has some pretty good play towards the end, to where, while I still think there's, again, probably some passiveness in her game at points, and in general, I do wish she was a bit more active of a player at point, and I still question her overall win equity, and I don't think she really had a winning path on this specific season due to Tom winning challenges, but I think she's in a spot where, again, I think she showed herself to be a pretty competent player, and I do have her here at number 4. Now number 3, and obviously the top 3 here are the top 3. The 3 people that had this alliance from the very beginning, ran the show the entire time, even even though, again, question marks within that. But at number 3, we're going to go off the person who sadly had the least amount of chance to win the game of those 3, and that person is Katie. And the thing about Katie, actually, is that I think my respect for Katie's game kind of went up on the rewatch, to where while I do think Katie is someone that, again, had these opportunities to make these big moves against the men and never really did so, I feel like she still plays a pretty solid game despite that. Again, she's in this spot where she's really the core of the majority group, where we see from the very beginning on, where, again, we obviously see her initially bond with Tom and Ian, but once we get to the actual Crore tribe, again, we see a 5-person alliance form of Greg, Jen, Katie, Tom, and Ian, in a spot where Katie is by far the most insulated player in that group. Again, she is essentially in the middle of the two duos, where she's in the middle of the Tom and Ian duo and the Greg and Jen duo, while also, again, having a strong connection to Jen. For a while, I do think she would have picked Greg over her. Again, she at least had that connection. She also had a very strong connection to Ian. That was actually a final 2, and Ian would have cut Tom for Katie, to where I think from a pure positioning standpoint, I think Katie's in the best position pretty much the entire season. I think that is something that is to be applauded. The issue is obviously win equity, and I think that is the big criticism of Katie's game, is the fact that I don't think she can win the game. So while I think she played a very good game to get to the final 2, I think she is playing a game that doesn't really garner much respect from her fellow players, where while I personally would very much consider voting for Katie, I do feel like a lot of the jury never really did, and I feel like when looking at the board, I think the only person I could see Katie beating is Karen, which, again, I think that is also probably one of the bigger negatives of Katie's game, the fact that, again, she doesn't really build bonds with these people outside of her core group. And I feel like Karen is someone that was such wasted potential, where, again, she could have really cultivated this relationship with Karen. I think had she been able to do so, she could have been able to make this big move at the final 7, which, to be fair, I don't know if she actually would have gone through with anyway. But I do think her inability to make the move against Tom at final 7 really stems from the fact that she mismanages Karen throughout a lot of the game. But also, she also just kind of gives up on even trying to win the game. And she ends up getting to this spot where she's kind of becomes resigned and just going to the end with Tom and Ian, knowing that she can't beat them, but just like feeling bad about taking them out, which, again, credit to Tom and Ian for doing so. But I do think that is really one of the major criticisms of Katie's game, as, again, she had all the pieces lined up to expertly navigate through this game with still at least like a winning scenario towards the end, but again, simply just doesn't take it because of her hatred for Karen, but also the fact that, again, she just feels bad for Tom and Ian, which while I get it from a personal standpoint, is obviously still a major ding against her game here. In terms of like navigation through the game, her game is pretty solid. Like, I think it is nearly spotless, where, again, she's just never targeted the entire time and has a say in boot during most rounds. Again, obviously she didn't want Greg to go in the round that he went, and I think that is obviously a criticism there, but really outside that, again, I do think she was a major swing vote throughout a lot of the game, and I do think Katie is a player that, again, I do have a lot of respect for that. But again, the reason why she's not higher on this list is because, again, at the end of the day, she couldn't win the game. Tom and Ian both beat her at the end. Even Jen beats her at the end. Even, again, going beyond just Karen, again, we got Greg, Stephanie probably beats her at the end. Again, I think she is really struggling to win this game and has to get into this very precise scenario. But again, I do have a lot of respect for how she navigates through the game and how she positions herself, which, again, for me is enough to put her here number 3. And number 2, and this might be a bit closer than people think. And I think when people talk about Palau, people talk about how, oh, Tom just dominated the game, one of the most impressive players of all time. However, again, I think it's close between Tom and Ian. And you know what? After thinking it through a lot, screw it. I have Tom at number 2, and I think this is like further supported by my rewatch. And I've been thinking about this for a while. I didn't rewatch Palau before my latest rewatch for a while, actually. Opinion of Tom's game had been constantly going down, and ever reassessing his game, I kind of realized the fact that Tom was a player that essentially just won out, that no one planned on going to the end with him. No one wanted him in the final 2. He just won the challenges at the end and ended up getting there. And really, that's the bulk of Tom's game. Where, while, again, I do think he has some very impressive aspects, this whole strategy aspects of the game that we'll talk about, I still think it's a spot where he largely wins the games due to challenges. I think it's a spot where, again, I think Tom is just very overrated in like every aspect of the game outside of challenges, where obviously, again, one of the most impressive challenge competitors in the history of the show. Again, obviously led Crore to winning so many challenges in the pre-merge, obviously completely demolished Oolong, obviously won 5 out of 7 immunity challenges post-merge as well. Again, a really insane stat that, again, allowed there to be almost no opportunities to take him out. And even in the opportunities that there were, he had shields around him. Again, at the final 7, he had Stephanie as a shield that kept him safe. Even in a spot where, again, he didn't even necessarily want Stephanie to go, but again, still, it's like he had a shield in front of him there that he, again, kept him safe. And at final 6, again, while he was probably safe there no matter what, due to Greg, again, thinking that the final 5 plan is something that would work out for him, which, to be fair, again, if Tom didn't go in the immunity run, it probably does. I don't think that's necessarily due to anything that Tom did right. It's not like Tom was manipulating the others into keeping around that spot. It was simply a spot where everyone was going to do that. Even Tom, in a spot where it didn't even benefit Tom to go to the 5 with his 5-person alliance. He kind of gets saved by the fact that Ian is the one to really propose flipping the vote, which obviously Tom gets on board with. And obviously from that point on, on, he wins out. Now, does he need those immunity wins at that specific point? A bit unsure. Again, at Final 5, I do think it's very rocky. I think it is a position where he likely is at least in danger. I do think Greg and Jen definitely go for him in that spot. Obviously, it does come down to Katie, who has talked post-show about how she would have felt bad about taking out Tom. So I do think I'm being vulnerable in this spot where Ian and Katie both talk about taking him out at 4. Again, I would not completely rule it out at 5. Oh, well, at 4, I think he is definitely saved by winning immunity. And again, that's literally a spot where we see Ian and Katie openly talking about taking out Tom, who are obviously going to get shut down when Tom wins immunity. But again, Ian literally tells Tom to his face that he was considering voting him out. So I think that's a spot where he definitely need to win immunity. And again, it's him actively going to a final 3 position where he needs to win the final immunity, where he really is in this end game stretch where just no one is actively wanting to take him to the end of the game. And he gets very fortunate in the comp results that allow him to get to a winning position. Even beyond that, the other aspects of his game are like very much overrated. Again, people talk about how he's a triple threat, how he's good socially, good strategically. Socially, again, yeah, he was good with people within his alliance, and again, he was able to do some good work at Janu. He also like completely ostracizes Kobe. He hated his guts and would have never voted for him at the end. Also, again, very much comes off as very misogynistic at points, which again annoys the likes of Jen. And again, also very much strong arms people, and is also like kind of unaware of his game. And I think that's also the thing that's not really stated about Tom, is that Tom isn't that far away from coach. The fact that it feels like Tom is just very unaware of the fact that he is utilizing these manipulation tactics. And again, at Final Tribal, like talks as if he didn't manipulate people across the game, which I think is also kind of bad. And when we're looking at his strategic game's not even that great. Or again, yeah, he's able to be part of this majority alliance at the very beginning, but he's also at the bottom of it and doesn't really do much to get out of that the entire season. Again, really gets lucked out by the fact that he wins those final comps, where had it not been the case, he's simply just gone because he's at the bottom of his majority alliance. Where while he does do good work, and again, building a bond with Janu, building a bond with Karen, he ends up being in a spot where he wants to let them go. Again, his initial plan at the Final 6 was to vote out Karen until Ian ends up bringing up the idea of blindsiding Greg. Also, even at the Final 5, he votes out Karen in a spot where Karen was probably one of his only saving graces at that point, where literally everyone else for sure wanted him gone, where I think Karen's the only person that would have even considered taking him to the end. And beyond that, again, he wants to save Stephanie, fails at that. I mean, even at Final 4, again, people give him a lot of credit for flipping on Ian, but again, that's even a spot where he doesn't do so until literally the last second, where his initial plan was to go to Final 3 at the end, which is so stupid. Where again, at least with Ian, at least Ian considered taking out Tom along the way, and again, potentially would have. Like, Tom never seemed to be considering taking out Ian in that endgame stretch until we found out about Ian going against him. I think the one thing I would say that is a benefit for Tom is win equity. I think Tom beats Ian at the end, and I think that is at least something to praise from Tom there. However, really outside that, I think Tom's game is one that I just do not look at particularly highly at this point. I do think the talk about how he dominated the game is very much overstated. I don't think he really dominated much at all outside of challenges, where even when we're looking at his influence in the votes, he doesn't even really influence the votes that much most of the time. And it's really either, again, Ian doing so in a way that benefits him, or it's a spot where he tries to and fails. So where, again, I don't think Tom's game is really that great, but again, he obviously dominates the challenges, gets to the end in a spot where he is pretty unbeatable in the final 2. I think maybe he loses against Stephanie. I think that's literally the only shot that he loses, to where, again, at least that's something. I do think Tom's, again, threat management is really abysmal. I do think his social game is very mixed. I think his strategic game is one where he fails pretty often and ends up being lucked into the better case scenarios constantly. So again, I just think Tom's game is very overrated. He's here number 2. Now number 1. Again, we got Ian, and as much as I talk about Tom's game being overrated, straight up, Ian's game's not flawless either. It's not like I'm saying Ian is this all-time great player and played this all-time great game. However, I do think Ian plays a more solid game than Tom. Again, plays a game that he's more stably in the majority, was safer in the game. Also had a decent chunk of win equity. Now, again, not unbeatable at the end. But again, I think he beats Katie. That was always his plan the entire season, was go to the end of Katie. And again, really plays the game like stably in the majority. Again, right away in the alliance with Tom and Katie. They again end up being aligned with Greg and where again, he at least wasn't the initial target once they get down to 5. And even when they get down to 4, he at least has Katie solidly on his side. He at least gets to make fire, which again, considering him being a very good fire maker, probably wins that fire making challenge. To that point, again, probably wins final immunity, probably wins the game. Again, I think he's in a spot where even within his group, he's in a very good spot to go on to win the game, largely because of his connection with Katie, where despite how much fracturing there seemed to be and the fact that he got into arguments constantly towards the end game, it's still a spot where she does stick by him. She never does turn on him, which I do think that is very good work for Ian. Now, again, I think Ian does have some very sloppy play, though. Again, obviously his reward challenge pick was something that was just unnecessary, burns Katie for no reason, him being a bit sloppy in conversation, being a bit too loose with information that gets back to other people. I think that is bad, obviously. Realistically, I think Tom is probably the better player than Ian in the grand scheme of things, especially like what we saw of them from Palau. However, I do think Ian's game is better. Again, Ian's game is, again, more stable, not in a spot where he needs to win out in many challenges. I mean, really, the only challenge he needed to win was Final Immunity. Even then, if Katie had won, she would have taken Ian too, where he would have won. Where, again, he had the better odds at the time of the final 3. Even then, even Tom was willing to take Ian to the end by the end, only for Ian to turn that down. Which, obviously, again, that's something that I feel like some people are probably going to criticize him for, that final 3 vote. I don't, because I don't feel like that really was a game decision. I feel like that was a decision he made out of the game, which obviously is still a criticism against him in the sense that he'd be someone willing to make a move within the scope of the game. But I still think it's a spot where Ian, again, theoretically had the win had he just won that final immunity challenge. And again, despite his sloppiness with like Tom at final 4, again, he still survives the final 4 round. Would have survived it even more cleanly if he did not tell Tom that he considered taking him out. And again, I would give him the most credit for pulling off the Greg blindside. I think he is the one to really put that plan together. And again, unlike Tom, who again just kind of rides with his majority group and is just kind of resolute in being at the bottom of it, Ian was again riding with that same group, but again wasn't at the bottom of it. So again, for me, it's like in the comparison between Tom and Ian, I think Ian is just better than Tom in almost every aspect of the game outside of challenges. Where again, if Tom does not go in that immunity run, I think Ian is very likely the winner of the season. So again, if you just shake up what the immunity challenges are, again, final immunity challenge of Palau was instead the final immunity challenge that was used for Guatemala. Ian wins the season. So again, I think Tom is someone again is very benefited by the specific challenges that were picked, while Ian is someone that was disfavored by the fact that Tom kept on winning challenge after challenge and challenge in a spot where again Ian probably beats almost everybody else but Tom in challenges, while also never had the opportunity to take Tom out of the game when he wanted to where again at the end of the day I think Ian's game is again just a step above Tom, just again simply could not win those challenges towards the end, which cost him the game. But again, for me, Ian plays the type of game that I would respect a bit more, even though again still sloppy along the way, but still I think better than Tom at least. So he's here number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Survivor Palau. Moving forward again, I'll be doing the same thing for Guatemala at the end of the year. So stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.